Okay, so I think we'll start. I am Magda Teller. I'm the Literature and Judaic Studies here at Fordham University, and I'm really delighted to welcome you tonight for our, I think it's the third this year, lecture in our Fordham New York Public Library lecture series in Jewish Studies, which is part of our partnership program where we bring in fellows from outside the New York City area to do research in the Rot Jewish division at the New York Public Library at the main building on 42nd Street, the Schwartzman building, and then they share their work with us and with you, really. So it's our second year of this partnership. We hope to keep going, but we'll see how the funding continues. But it is really my great pleasure to introduce to you Nina Valbousquet, who is our long-term or mid-term fellow. She's here for the whole semester in New York. She had previously held fellowships at the Center for Jewish History and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and she's working on transnational anti-Semitism, diaspora politics, and Jewish diplomacy, and examining the impact of anti-Semitism on Jewish-Catholic relations in a transatlantic perspective. She received her PhD from Sciences Po in Paris, and her book, Catholiques et Antisémites, les réseaux transnationaux de Monsignor Benigni, will appear this year from a publishing house in France. As a joint fellow of Fordham and NYPL, she's working on the Jewish transcontinental diplomacy that aimed to raise awareness against anti-Semitism, especially among Catholics, between 1914 and 1965. It brings specific attention to the relations between American Jewish organizations and Catholic representatives in North America and Europe, notably the American Jewish community and the Vatican. Next year, she will begin her tenure at the École Française de Rome as a research fellow, and in that capacity, she will be, very excitingly, in charge of organizing collaborative projects related to the opening of Pius XII archives. And I think we'll bring her back so she can tell us more. So without further ado, before I cede the floor, I want to announce next coming up events. So you are off next week. We're free. We're not doing anything next week. But we're coming back with a vengeance before Passover. We have a lot of events coming up. There is the McGinley lecture series that Father Ryan puts every semester, and on April 9th is his talk at Lincoln Center, repeated on April 10th at the Bronx campus. On April 10th, however, we begin here a series of events devoted to Haggadot. We'll start with Adam Cohen's talk on medieval Haggadot. On the 14th, that Sunday, we'll have a half-a-day symposium on Haggadah and manuscripts. And then, very exciting, at the Bronx campus, and I hope you'll make the trip, it's really worth it, we're going to have an exhibition of Fordham's collection of Haggadot. And it is co-curated with Fordham students, and it's going to be really exciting, and they will be presenting, and we'll be presenting the collection on April 16th, but the exhibit will be from that April week through the end of the semester, so I hope we'll make it uptown. We have a lot of really interesting Haggadot, from Amharic to Judeo-Persian to Arabic from Cairo, so much for Yetziat Mitzrayim from 1946, and many others, early modern printed chronicles, and all lovingly used with stains, wine stains, and food stains, which we really love. So without further ado, Nina Valbousquet.
Thank you, Magda, for the kind introduction, and I want to thank the Fordham University and the New York Public Library for this wonderful fellowship that allows me to continue my research. And I want to thank also the friends and colleagues and students who are here today to listen to my talk. So I would like to start with a cartoon. A cartoon published on November 18, 1938, a few days after Kristallnacht in Germany. To some extent, it reminds me of some images that have been circulating on social media in recent years, portraying the Holy Family as Middle Eastern refugees. But in 1938, European Jews were at the center of the refugees crisis of that period. This cartoon was published in a liberal Catholic weekly, Commonwealth, that was based in New York City, alongside articles making a plea for Jewish refugees. For instance, on November 25, 1938, a front-page editorial of Commonwealth called for, quote, an immediate modification of the American immigration laws. All quota allotments should be suspended in favor of refugees. However, at the same time, Father Charles Coughlin broadcast from New York City his infamous radio speech of November 20, 1938, blaming German Jews for being responsible for anti-Semitic persecutions and accusing Jewish immigrants of introducing communism and atheism in America. Coughlin drew upon nativist feelings and the fear of refugees in order to rally followers, including in the Christian front, on behalf of so-called Christian values, as you can see here on this picture taken in 1939 in New York City. But Father Coughlin and the Christian front were also denounced by Catholics, especially in the Voice for Human Rights, a publication of the Committee of Catholics for Human Rights, an organization founded by Fordham professor Emmanuel Chapman in spring 1939. So these few examples show that anti-Semitism was a divisive topic among American Catholics. Indeed, the second half of the 1930s bore witness to an unprecedented wave of political anti-Semitism in the US, which seduced some sectors of American Catholicism, while it also outraged other Catholics. So the question I want to address tonight is how did Jews in America respond to this wave of anti-Semitism, and specifically Christian anti-Semitism? And what was the impact of anti-Semitism on Jewish-Catholic relations in the US? And so I will address these questions with four different points. In this presentation, I will focus on the American Jewish Committee, founded in 1906 in New York. During the interwar period, the American Jewish Committee was one of the three secular and national organizations of Jewish defense in the US, alongside the Anti-Defamation League, created in 1913, and the American Jewish Congress in 1918. So obviously the American Jewish Committee is not utterly representative of the sociological complexity of American Jewry, yet its impact was significant during the interwar period, notably in matters pertaining to politics, foreign affairs, and relations with the broader society, and intergroup relations specifically, and especially with Christians. So my point here is not to assess the past actions of American Jewish organizations in terms of success or failure, but rather to understand how they addressed anti-Semitism and what does that say about the historical shapes of anti-Semitism in the US. So for instance, throughout the interwar period, the American Jewish Committee claimed publicly that anti-Semitism was un-American and un-Christian, so that the two expressions that I chose for the title of my talk, but with a question mark. So let me first try to unpack the implications of that statement. The American Jewish Committee, in December 1920, issued a statement denouncing the diffusion of the famous anti-Semitic forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, in the US, notably through the publications of Henry Ford. The statement by the American Jewish Committee described anti-Semitism as a form of un-American and un-Christian agitation because its goal was the division of all citizens along racial and religious lines. So the initiatives of the committee at the beginning of the 1920s bore witness to the confidence of an elite of American Jews who tend to play down the extent of domestic anti-Semitism. They presented the diffusion of anti-Semitism in the US as an imported product from Europe, which was not only threatening the values of Americanness, but was also a secular plague incompatible with Christian principles. So, claiming that anti-Semitism had no roots in American politics, the American Jewish Committee offered an apologetic discourse on Jewish integration, thus forging a narrative of American Jewish exceptionalism. Two leaders of the American Jewish Committee contributed to this post-war narrative. Herman Bernstein was the founder of the Jewish newspaper The Day, and Louis Marshall, who was a famous lawyer and president of the American Jewish Committee from 1912 to 1929. In a letter written to Bernstein in October 1921, Marshall was very overconfident and said, "One thing is certain, that the protocols have been absolutely destroyed." But we know from history that it went differently. The protocols came back on a wider scale after 1933, including in the US with the publication of Father Coughlin. So if anti-Semitism was publicly labeled as un-Christian and un-American, in private, however, American Jewish leaders addressed some aspects of Christian anti-Semitism in the US. But these concerns were limited to specific fields, such as mass media and education. For instance, in 1927, Louis Marshall wrote to the movie producer William Fox to denounce the biblical movie The King of Kings. According to Marshall, the film was based on a misconstruction of the crucifixion story that reproduced the accusation of the deicide against Jews as traditionally conveyed by religious education in the US. And here in this letter, Marshall remembered his own childhood memories in Syracuse in a public school. He remembered being physically attacked and insulted by his Christian schoolmates, especially on Good Friday during Easter. So in a way, the American Jewish Committee's specific concern for education and mass media reinforced the common wisdom that anti-Semitism in the US was mainly social and attitudinal rather than political. And yet, Christian anti-Semitism in the 1930s, was not just religious or cultural, but it was also political, as exemplified by Charles Coughlin. So while in the 1920s, Bernstein and Marshall could still claim that anti-Semitism was an archaic form of bigotry, mainly imported from Europe, this view became increasingly challenged during the 1930s, and the paradigm of un-American and un-Christian anti-Semitism slowly began to crumble. Indeed, global and domestic anti-Semitism resurfaces in the US in the second half of the 1930s because of the repercussions of the New Deal, of the Great Depression, the political backlash of the New Deal, and the worsening of the international situation, which fostered tensions toward and resentment toward religious and ethnic minorities and immigrants. So the propagation of anti-Semitic myth about the international Jew, the Jewish world conspiracy, and Judeo-communism reached a new level of mass diffusion, and more organized and political type of anti-Semitic groups emerged at the end of the 1930s. So what was the role of American Catholics in that context? The rise of domestic anti-Semitism in the second half of the 1930s included a tide of Catholic anti-Semitism, as Father Gregory Feige, who was a close collaborator of the American Jewish Committee, put it in a report for the committee in 1939. In the US, a more political and outspoken form of anti-Semitism accused Jews of taking part in communist revolutions and anti-clerical policies in Spain, Mexico, the Soviet Union, and France. And more generally accused Jews of working to destroy Christianity everywhere. So the members of the American Jewish Committee were aware of this type of conflation. I put in a memorandum dated March 1939, quote, "There is developing a subtle form of anti-Semitism in the Catholic press. When certain communists are spoken of as Jewish communists or as Jewish radicals, and when Einstein is labeled a typical Jewish radical refugee who does not belong here, and to some degree all liberals who oppose some particular Catholic project have been branded as communist." So Father Coughlin is a striking example of this type of rhetoric. He was born in Ontario. Coughlin was a Catholic priest based in Michigan, and from 1924 to 1942, he was a very popular radio preacher with an audience of 9 million strong followers and sometimes reaching 30 or 40 million listeners. He was a fierce opponent to Roosevelt, New Deal, and he founded a proto-political movement, the National Union for Social Justice, in 1934, and a Detroit-based weekly Social Justice in 1936. Coughlin anti-Semitism surfaces as early as 1931, when he attributed the 1929 crash to Jewish financiers. But definitely reached a peak in 1938 when Coughlin republished the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in Social Justice from July to November 1938. On August 8, for instance, 1938, Social Justice gave names of alleged Jewish banks accused of having financed the Bolshevik Revolution, as well as names of Bolshevik activists who were considered Jewish. This in order to reach the following conclusions. All this goes to prove that Stalin's government, in spite of all its attempts at camouflage, has never been and will never be a national government. Israel will always be the controlling power and driving force behind it. As a matter of fact, the conspiracy against civilization in the world emanates from Russia or from those who are responsible for organizing the Russian Revolution under the leadership of Trotsky and other bad Jews who have not been castigated in the Jewish pulpits of America. In the radio broadcast of November 20, 1938, Coughlin complained that the American press and American government were more upset about Jews in Germany than about anti-clerical policies in Mexico and Spain. He presented fascism as, quote, a defense mechanism against Judeo-communism. But communism itself, for Coughlin, was originally a defense mechanism against, quote, atheist Jews in high finance. So this radio sermon was also printed in 1939 in a volume entitled Am I an Anti-Semite? In which Coughlin obviously claimed that he was not anti-Semitic. So if Coughlin may sound like an extreme case, a similar kind of discourse also appeared in mainstream Catholic publications, such as America, a major Catholic weekly in the US, published in New York and run by the Jesuits. America was not specifically reactionary or anti-Semitic, but yet, in June 1939, the Jesuit magazine, blamed international Jewry. quoting here, one phase of the Palestine problem that is impressive is the force and the vehemence of the attack of international Jewry. The union of sentiment, the similarity of method, the use of propaganda, the moral pressure of Jews in every nation, particularly in the British Commonwealth and the United States, all manifest that Jewry is an international power, that it is aggressive and maybe restless. And I'm continuing for sentence below. The problem of Palestine may provoke a new orientation of ideas in regard to the place of the Jewish race in world affairs. In the United States, likewise, there is in process a new Jewish consciousness characterized by militancy and acumen. This also requires a new American evaluation and orientation. So this kind of display of overt anti-Semitism in Catholic publications provoked also a counter-reaction in some liberal sectors of American Catholicism, including in Commonwealth magazine that I already mentioned in my introduction. So for instance, a front-page editorial on December 9, 1938 reacted to the infamous speech of Coughlin and denounced Coughlin's political expediency as so a priest seeking with no little energy secular power of his own in political life, and denouncing the habit of special selection in loading blame on Jews recalls too vividly the propaganda of the Nazis before they took power. So here the mechanism of making Jews scapegoat. So two of the writers of Commonwealth were at the forefront of the fight against anti-Semitism, and they actively collaborated with the American Jewish Committee. George Shuster and Gregory Feige. So George Shuster was the managing editor of Commonwealth from 1928 until 1937, and he was then appointed president of Hunter College in 1939. He was an important intermediary between the American Jewish Committee and Catholic organizations, such as the National Catholic Welfare Conference, the main committee of the Catholic hierarchy in the US, the Catholic Association for International Peace, and he was also active in the National Conference of Christians and Jews. Father Gregory Feige was a Catholic priest from Little Flower Monastery in Newton, New Jersey, and he was also a writer for Commonwealth. He had worked with John Ryan in the Social Action Department of the National Catholic Welfare Conference. And he also taught philosophy at Fordham University, briefly, I think in 1939, thanks to the support of Shuster. Father Feige was aware of the shortcomings of the church in its relations with Jews and anti-Semitism. He faced himself a lot of resistance within the Catholic Church. For instance, on April 2nd, 1939, he gave a Sunday talk for the Knight of Columbus Club in Brooklyn on the theme of an American and Catholic looks on anti-Semitism. He was interrupted several times by a group of noisy Catholics shouting offensive questions like these. Were you ever a Jew? Why are Jews hated if they are not Reds and immoral? Answer that one. Jews teach hate, that is, in their religion. Why talk so much about Jewish persecutions when the Christians are more so? The hungry Jewish Reds that escaped Germany came here to take our jobs. So at the end of the talk, they wave copies of social justice, and they shout that Father Coughlin is the only priest who tells the truth. So Shuster and Father Feige were also members of the Committee of Catholics to Fight Anti-Semitism. It was founded in April 1939 in New York by 3 young professors at Fordham University, including Emanuel Chapman, who was a professor of philosophy, and who was a convert from Judaism. So Chapman was also the editor of the committee journal titled The Voice for Human Rights, published for the first first time in June 1939. Initially, the committee was a direct response to the diffusion of Coughlin's anti-Semitism, and its goal was to demonstrate that Christian teaching, if correctly interpreted, was incompatible with all forms of anti-Semitism, racism, and bigotry. And in fact, the committee soon changed its name in Committee of Catholics for Human Rights in September 1939 to signify that anti-Semitism was part of a broader fight against intolerance, social, religious, racial intolerance, and against any form of discriminations. So it's worth noticing that the American Jewish Committee financially and intellectually supports the Committee of Catholics for Human Rights. But for the American Jewish Committee, the approach to the Catholics is, of course, the most difficult. So I took this quotation from a report of the American Jewish Committee in December 1942, and I think it's emblematic of the difficulties encountered by the American Jewish Committee over the previous decade when it tried to embark Catholics in the fight against anti-Semitism. This was actually a central matter for the American Jewish Committee, because the committee was convinced that Catholic voices against anti-Semitism would be more efficient and powerful and have a greater impact than Jewish voices. The same conclusion was reached by Father Gregory Feige, who collaborated very closely with the American Jewish Committee. At the end of 1939, he addressed the little impact of Jewish refutation of anti-Semitism upon Catholics who were following Coughlin. Quoting here, these followers of Coughlin are impervious to reason or arguments. They enjoy a closed mind on the subjects of the Jews. In my own experience, it has happened that such students, when the pamphlet issued by the Jewish organizations in reply to Father Coughlin was placed for their information in their library by me, told me through some of their spokesmen that it was a vain endeavor, for they could not consider any statements emanating from Jewish sources. So because in 1939, Father Feige was teaching at Fordham, I'm assuming he's talking about maybe the Fordham Library. So the interreligious fight against anti-Semitism faced three limitations, three difficulties. First, the pervasiveness of anti-Semitic myth and the conflation between Jews, communism, and anti-clericalism. The American Jewish Committee member lamented the lack of Catholic condemnation of Nazi anti-Semitism. And for instance, in 1934, the executive secretary of the American Jewish Committee, Maurice Feldman, wrote that in the course of our efforts to enlighten the public regarding the menace of Nazis, we have experienced some difficulty in our approach to the Catholic element. From a number of quarters, we have been confronted with the criticism that Jews failed to protest against the persecution of the Catholic Church some years ago in Mexico and more recently in Spain. And indeed, already in 1933, the Archbishop of Baltimore and several American Catholic bishops had asked the committee why they should be called upon to demonstrate their interest in Jews when, under the persecution of Roman Catholics in Mexico, the Jews of America voiced no protest. So the Assistant Secretary of the American Jewish Committee replied to the Archbishop of Baltimore saying that the distinction between anti-Semitic persecutions in Nazi Germany and anti-clerical persecution in Mexico had to do with different configurations of church-state relations. Quoting here, American citizens could not very well protest against the separation of church and state in Mexico when our own government is based on such separation. Jews certainly could not protest because they are in danger in any country in which there is an alliance between the states and any particular church. So the American Jewish Committee officials could not protest the separation of church and state in Mexico in their quality of both Jews and American citizens. The growing influence of anti-communism within the church in 1936-37 led Jewish leaders to detach themselves from any anti-fascist movement that was considered too close from communism or socialism. For instance, when American Jewish leaders, Judge Joseph Proskauer and Levi Strauss, met with the Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, who then became Pius XII. When they met with him in November 1936, they had prepared a list of names of Jewish leaders and rabbis who are opposed to communism because they regard it as hostile to the tenets of Judaism. So a list of names to give to Pacelli to prove that Jews were not communists. The second obstacle was the difficulty from a Jewish perspective to understand and approach efficiently the Catholic hierarchy. Unlike Jewish-Protestant relations in the US, the contacts with Catholics were most often personal and informal rather than organizational. Interfaith initiatives were still unusual and were unsatisfying. In most cases, the American Jewish Committee prefers to walk behind the scene and to let the local bishop, for instance, deal with issues of anti-Semitism. But the case of Father Coughlin in 1938 challenged this general strategy. Indeed, as demonstrated by historian Charles Coughlin, the Catholic leadership turned a blind eye on Coughlin anti-Semitic propaganda and did little to stop it. One of the reasons that explained the lack of reaction of the Catholic leadership in the US against Coughlin was the very tricky question of freedom of speech and the fear of anti-Catholicism in the US, especially since the precedent set by the scandal of Father Edward McGlynn, a New York priest who had been excommunicated by the New York Archbishop in 1887. So when the American Jewish Committee considered in May 1939 to call out the new Pope Pius XII against Coughlin, the co-founder of the American Jewish Committee, Cyrus Adler, was skeptical. He was skeptical that the Vatican would be willing to take a stand on a matter that was not strictly religious. He wrote, "A priest has a good deal of independence. He is only subject to the supervision of his bishop, and if he does not make statements which are in opposition to the dogmas of the Catholic Church, he is allowed to proceed unmolested." And finally, a third limitation in the interreligious fight against anti-Semitism was the difficulty to fully address the religious roots and the religious components of anti-Semitism. The American Jewish Committee was convinced that anti-Semitism among Catholics was a form of contamination by a secular and racist element. German racism and German Nazism were made responsible for the discourse between Jews and Christians in the US. And that's what Maurice Waldman, the executive, Maurice Waldman, the executive secretary of the American Jewish Committee, suggested to Joseph Proskauer before one of his public talks in June 1937. I imagine that you will also want to take advantage of the opportunity to point out how Nazi propaganda has diabolically attempted to distort the facts in order to generate hostility on the part of some religious groups against others. For example, trying to identify communism, against which the Catholic Church is arrayed, as a Jewish movement. Thus, Jewish leaders of the American Jewish Committee came to the misleading conclusion that the church condemnation of Nazism and racism was equivalent to a general rejection of anti-Semitism, including Christian anti-Semitism. So despite these general difficulties, I would like to draw your attention in the last part of my talk to the emergence of a common language forged through Jewish-Catholic collaborations against anti-Semitism. A recurrent strategy of the American Jewish Committee was to hold close to a logic of analogy, which drew a parallel in the minority status of Jews and Catholics in the US. For instance, in May 1938, the American Jewish Committee leaders discussed with Monsignor Michael Reddy, who was the General Secretary of the National Catholic Welfare Conference. They discussed ideas useful in combating anti-Semitism among Catholics. And they point out that Jews and Catholics were two religious minorities in Protestant America, and that the idea was to raise awareness among Catholics about, quote, the danger of one minority group attacking the other at the present time. Jews and Catholics are in the same boat in this country. If any totalitarian government ever seizes power, it will be a Protestant group. History proves that anti-Jewish movements invariably develop into anti-Catholic movements. So one factor that can explain this strategy was the new wave of anti-Catholicism in interwar America, especially the revival of the KKK in the 1920s, and the 1928 presidential campaign, in which there was a lot of anti-Catholic arguments against the Democratic nominee Al Smith. And in fact, Judge Joseph Proskauer from the American Jewish Committee was a former advisor to Al Smith during that campaign. So the rhetoric of analogy continued even during the war and shaped not only the fight against political anti-Semitism, but also the revision of Christian teaching. For instance, among other initiatives, in 1944, the American Jewish Committee drafted an outline for course of study to be used in the 8th grade in Sunday schools to promote interracial goodwill. Targeting a class of Irish Catholic children, the outline suggested the following statement to teach in class. A good Irish Catholic historian, because first, the Jews gave us our God and the first half of our Bible. Second, Jesus was born a Jew. Third, Jesus died to proclaim the brotherhood of men. And fourth, the Irish and the Jews are both minority groups in this country, both as to nationality and religion. And the same analogy, the same kind of rhetoric of analogy, appear in Father Feige's works that was supported by the American Jewish Committee. In particular, in 1945, a book entitled Catholics and Jews, A Study in Human Relations. And Father Feige wrote that one cause of anti-Jewish sentiment is traceable to the wave of Jewish immigration from 1881 to 1920. The Catholic mass immigration provides a parallel example. So this rhetoric of analogy was written by both Jewish and Catholic activists. And this type of common vocabulary drew upon actual collaborations that happened most often behind the scene. So in the case, for instance, with Gregory Feige and George Schuster. And the same type of analogy was also a recurrent argument in the publication of the Committee of Catholics for Human Rights that I mentioned earlier, between anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism. This is, for instance, in November 1939. So I would like to conclude with two additional examples from the period of the Second World War, two documents that I found in the American Jewish Committee archives, and that demonstrate both patterns of continuity and change between the 1930s and the period of the Holocaust. During the war, the American Jewish Committee promoted the work of Father John Elliot Roth, who was at that time chaplain at the University of Virginia, and he has been one of the main Catholic leaders involved in the National Conference of Christians and Jews. He was also writing for Commonwealth magazine. So in 1941, together with Rabbi Louis Finkelstein, he published the book The Religions of Democracy, Judaism, Catholicism, Protestantism in Creed and Life, which included the following statement. Racial and religious mobocracy is like a forest fire that obviously cannot be restricted to a particular kind of tree. So persecution by irresponsible groups cannot be restricted to any particular race or religion. And with the experience of the APA, the American Protective Association, and the KKK as an indication, Catholics can be sure that if anti-Semitism continues, they will be the next victims. So in 1941, but that was reprinted in 1943. But while the book continued this kind of rhetoric of analogy that I tried to show in my talk, the book also denied any possible religious roots of anti-Semitism. And I'm quoting here, anti-Semitism does not start from religious devotion. Jewish-Christian relations would be decidedly better if religiously Jews were better Jews and Christians were better Christians. 1 year later, in September 1942, Israel Goldstein, who was a conservative rabbi and the president of the Synagogue Council of America, wrote a letter to Monsignor Michael Reddy, who I already mentioned as the General Secretary of the National Catholic Welfare Conference. I'm quoting here the letter. An epic of martyrdom is being written by Jew and Christian together in the concentration camps, in the ghettos, and in the firing yards of Hitler Europe. Jewish herds go out to our Christian brothers in affliction. Christianity and Judaism, which have had a great common spiritual ancestry to bind them together, now have a great common peril to draw them closer to one another. So a sort of shared victimization here. And I think in this example, the context of extreme persecutions during the Holocaust transformed the rhetoric of analogy shaped in the 1930s and drew it closer to the beginning of a form of interfaith dialogue. So the political context at the end of the 1930s contributed to the forging of a concept of Judeo-Christian tradition before it became more crystallized, I think, in the post-Holocaust and Cold War period. In that sense, the Holocaust was a watershed, a turning point that reinforced the American Jewish community's conviction that it was imperative to reach Catholics on social and political grounds, but also on religious grounds. So in 1945, the American Jewish community inaugurated its Interreligious Affairs Department that was designed to foster collaboration and mutual understanding between Jews and Christians. That was led by Rabbi Maurice Kerzer, the father of the historian David Kerzer, who had been a Jewish chaplain in the US Army in Italy during the war. So in the midst of persecution, a new vocabulary of brotherhood emerged slowly, as shown by the letter by Israel Goldstein from 1942, which resonated with historian John Connolly's book titled From Enemy to Brother, published in 2012. But the revolution in Catholic teaching on the Jews, to quote the subtitle of the same book, took 20 more years before it became official with Nostra Aetate, the Vatican Declaration Nostra Aetate, in 1965. On that long path, Jewish activists contributed to the revision of the teaching of contempt, as exemplified by the work of Julie Zahak, which was translated and promoted in the US by the American Jewish Committee. Thus, this history is not only a matter of church history, but it's also part of a Jewish history. Thank you.
I grew up in Albany, New York, during the Second World War, and Albany has a large Catholic population. And my experience was that the main cathedral in the city, which had a cathedral school, were teaching the children that Jews killed their God. So I was attacked a number of times by other children when I was a child on that basis. So I think it was all very good what you have spoken about from the intellectual level. Certainly Commonweal, a lay organization, has much to be commended for, but the Catholic Church as itself, under the previous popes, were teaching in this manner. And it wasn't until Pope John the 23rd and the Vatican II conference that they decided not to teach this to their children. And I think that was probably a bigger source of anti-Semitism in this country and throughout the world than menaces like Father Coughlin, who was an extremist.
I think these are two important and different sources of anti-Semitism, and I agree that let's say the local, social, cultural impact of the Catholic Church in this type of context is actually, very important. And that's when I presented one of my first examples about Louis Marshall, who was the president of the American Jewish Committee. He wrote this letter to William Fox saying that when he was a kid in this public school in Syracuse, so it was a public school, but there was Bible reading, and during Good Friday, he said like the teacher was very presenting Jews as, having like Christ killers, and he said like being physically attacked and insulted. And I found that in many different letters, and I found it an interesting case because Louis Marshall usually represents this kind of elite of American Jewry, but I think that also reflected some like actual social reality. So I agree that this is a very important factor. And in fact, the American Jewish Committee tried throughout decades to change Christian religious textbooks. And they were mostly successful with liberal Protestants, but with the Catholic Church, it took more years. And I think in this perspective, the Holocaust was a turning point. And it's only in the 50s, 60s that really this collaboration with Catholics became more successful, and that until the Second Vatican Council.
You started, thank you by the way for a very nice talk. You started by saying you weren't going to discuss what worked or didn't work. You were going to present what people did to try to push back. Do you have thoughts on what works and doesn't work? Because I think, at this point in my life, I've heard lots about causes of anti-Semitism, but I haven't heard much about how we go about at least suppressing it. I'm not looking for kumbaya, but any views on what the best ways are to keep it, along with other racism, under wraps?
That's a difficult question to answer now, but what I meant by not really assessing in terms of success and failure is that I think in the scholarship, when we look at Jewish responses, there's the tendency to be very judgmental and kind of not looking really what were the motives, the dilemmas that these American Jewish organizations were facing. So most of the scholarship on the American Jewish Committee is saying, oh, it's an elite group, and by the way, they're unsuccessful, so well, who cares? So I wanted to look more in details about these different strategies, in fact. So, as a historian, I don't know if I can really make a judgment on it, but from my perspective, I would say I feel this strategy of trying to show that one type of prejudice can also lead to other prejudices, maybe could be successful, because the point was, in this case, was to say anti-Semitism is not only the problem of Jews. That should not concern only Jews. That should concern the society, because it's a question of pluralism, it's a question of democracy. So I think this is a good strategy, even today, to point out that this is not only a matter that should concerns Jews, but really like American citizens also of other countries.
Just as a follow-up, if you were to study different dioceses and see as Commonweal publishes and other leaders articulate their thoughts on anti-Semitism, can you quantitate in any way if the people, the hierarchy, says to their parish priests, we want you to preach thus and so, that begins to make a difference versus those who don't take the leadership's position and try to translate it down the hierarchy?
I think it does make a difference. I think that doesn't make a difference, and especially when you see testimonies of what happened. For instance, your comments about like the teaching, and I mean, I think it had an actual impact, especially education, especially in this kind of religious teaching context. So I think it does have an impact, yes.
Can I just add a comment? One thing that struck me is one of the comments that we cannot, these people don't accept any sources that come from Jews, right?
Yeah.
So it's this sort of, what are people reading? What are their sources of authority? And that's why, in my own work, I see that as well, that it's so important that these figures of authority make a statement, even if it doesn't matter. That is, people are still going to be teaching that kind of thing. If that those public statements give grounds to people who do want to make a difference, say, oh, Bishop so-and-so said that, oh, Rabbi so-and-so said that. And that gives them this sort of grounded authority in this way. So it may not make a difference on everybody, but it can give tools for those who want to make a difference. So I see one over there, and then here.
Yes, my question's a follow-up in a way to that question about the impact of authority or good leadership. First, Nina, thank you so much for a very lucid presentation with much important information. It was certainly new and important from my perspective. One thing that struck me was Cyrus Adler saying that a priest is only controlled by his bishop. In other words, his chain of command is the bishop and the pope. And one bit of information that I know is that two things. Father Coughlin announced his retirement from radio preaching about 3 days after Eugenio Pacelli, Secretary of State, in that picture next to Joe Kennedy, met with Franklin Delano Roosevelt at Hyde Park for lunch. About 3 days later, said, I'm done. Then also, that November 20th radio address, which was so vitriolic, equating Judaism and communism, Jews and communists, and his publication of the protocols, happened within a year after he got a new bishop. And the new bishop was very closely connected to the Vatican Secretary of State, which had been run by Eugenio Pacelli, because that new bishop, Edward Mooney, in Detroit, had been the Vatican ambassador, first to India and then to Japan, operating directly under Eugenio Pacelli. So my question is, number one, is there any archival material that has come to light about the interaction between the Pope, the Vatican Secretary of State on the one hand, and Charles Coughlin in that November 20th period and after, when his anti-Semitism just went off the charts, and also with Mooney? And number two, is that a fruitful area for future research, given the archives that are opening next year?
So historian Charles Gallagher was based at Boston College, did a lot of research on that topic, and he showed that the Archbishop of Detroit, the new one in 1937, Mooney, right?
Mooney, yes.
That was actually trying to stop Father Coughlin, but really couldn't do so much. And one of the things that is important is that because Father Coughlin went beyond the usual traditional jurisdictional geography of the Catholic Church because he was on the radio. So that was not only just a publication, that was really something national. So in a way that he was very modern in that aspect, and that was very, I think, a challenge for the Catholic Church in the US, a question very of hierarchical relations. And Charles Gallagher showed that the apostolic delegate in the US, so the representative of the Vatican in the US, Cicconiani in Washington, was very kind of reluctant to do anything about Charles Coughlin, and did influence Archbishop Mooney. But there were also, Coughlin had a lot of support, including the main editor of America, which I showed before, the Jesuit magazine. And Gallagher went to see the archives of America and showed that the main editor was very, very in favor of Charles Coughlin, and did some pressure to make sure that he could stay, I could still publish, especially things around anti-communism. So usually this kind of support, they tend to turn like a blind eye on anti-Semitism, on the anti-Semitism of Charles Coughlin, and just look at his anti-communism and say like he was doing good things for the church in the US. And the second question is, yes, of course, I think there's so much to look forward to the new opening of Pius XII archives next year, especially because Charles Coughlin was silenced only in 1942 after Pearl Harbor, so that's very connected to the context of the US entering the war. So I think there's so much to do before, to look at the period 1939 until 1942 to see what happened there in relation between the Vatican, the hierarchy in the US, in Washington, and locally also. So there are different scales to look at, different levels.
Thank you.
Question over there, and then
Okay. First, and you'll forgive my saying this because I was once a doctoral candidate at Boston College, but I have to pick up on this gentleman's comment and to state my credentials that these teeth are all artificial because they were kicked out in 1953 for killing Jesus just before Easter and in the midst of the Red Scare. And this happened in Lower Manhattan. But what I want to focus on is two areas that you just barely touched on that I think this last question really helped to throw a light on. One is conflicts between Jews and Irish. In the secession of immigration, the fight for urban space, the fight for positions in financially, let's say in the working class, the lower middle class, and the middle class. Because I realized in the passage of time that the language that I had for having my teeth kicked out, which was because I killed Jesus, really had to do with a lot of the conflicts between Jews and Irish for space in the Lower East Side and even in Stuyvesant Town right after the war. So throughout the history of New York, you have this tremendous conflict between the two groups. The other thing I was wondering about in your talk that you alluded to, and the last question I thought really drew a good light on, is the role of the church, is the fact that the church is not just an American organization, but an international one. And in my own sort of readings and research in the last years, I've looked a lot at the role of the Catholic Church, let's say, in Austria, of course in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, and in Austria where it had a particularly vile function, and in Germany where it was a much more ambiguous one. And I wonder, in your research, do you intend to broaden out at all from this rather narrow basis of Commonweal and the AGC, which is New York, and which is elite New York of the time, and to go to tie in the things like the last question that was asked and the points that I bring up?
Yeah. Thank you very much. So for the conflict between Irish and Jews in New York, that's a very important factor, and I think that's why the American Jewish community was also trying to address specifically Irish Catholics. And in fact, so Coughlin and the Christian Front in Boston and New York was important, and there were a series of street violence against Jews in Boston and New York in November, December 1938, after Coughlin made his speech. And what the historical research shows is that policemen, mostly Irish Catholics, tend to be indifferent, or at least to not very intervene in this kind of street violence between the Christian front and Jews. So there was one, there are few episodes like that in 1938, 39. But I didn't do the research on that. It's mainly Charles Gallagher, for instance, did a lot about the Christian front in Boston. So that's the local level.
Right.
For the global level then, yes, that's part of my research. I mean, my PhD before was something more transnational about the church and anti-Semitism and clerical fascism in France and Italy. So I've been dealing with that before. And my next project will actually incorporate this American aspect with a more global aspect, looking at Jewish diplomacy, transnational Jewish diplomacy, and how they try to approach the Catholic Church on different levels, including with the Vatican. So for instance, the American Jewish Committee was sending letters to the Vatican during the interwar period. They tried to intervene during the Holocaust with the Vatican. So that's an important aspect. And also, the American Jewish Committee was aware that the Catholic Church was a global power. And actually, it's interesting because they present themselves, the American Jewish Committee, as being kind of powerless and saying that the Catholic Church was a global power and that the Catholic Church, because of that, should intervene in favor of Jews. So,
If I could just throw in a little afterward, very briefly, because I know there's other questions. When you get to the 1960s, I wonder if cooperation is a function of some major change in the religious groups, or because of something of real reality in the United States, which is that as African Americans fought for their valid place within the society and for jobs and labor union membership in the city of New York, all of a sudden then, that some parts of the church and of the Irish population suddenly said to Jews, okay, you're white, be our pals, out of the searching for allies in a struggle to prevent other people, and there always had been a tension between Irish and blacks for jobs, for position, also for urban space, and I think there was a great deal of cynicism for that. I'm not speaking about the efforts of John the 23rd, but I'm speaking here locally in the U.S.
Yes, the comments by this gentleman awakened some thoughts from my childhood, which was also that it was the Irish boys in the neighborhood who were aggressive towards the Jewish boys. On the other hand, not the Italian boys in the neighborhood. So I am wondering, the names we saw on the screen for church hierarchy, as well as Catholics who were supportive of Jews, were largely Irish names. The hierarchy was still largely Irish.
Yes.
You mentioned how so many in the police force was Irish. So I am wondering if there was something particular about the Irish influence in American Catholicism. And incidentally, just the other day, I was surprised to read that who was the head of Ireland in this period? The name beginning with V? Yes, that he was a supporter of Hitler's. I hadn't known that. So I don't know if there was any influence also coming from Ireland to the Irish in the U.S. I don't know how great his influence was in terms of Ireland too, and given his pro-Nazi sympathies.
Yeah, I also don't really know about that. But what I can just say is just the sociological aspect of the Catholic Church in the US was, still mainly Irish, and I guess this has to do with different waves of immigration, and the fact that, Irish immigration was a little bit earlier than really Italian immigration, so I guess that's related to that aspect. There are a few examples of Italian publications that were more favorable to the Catholic Church speaking out against anti-Semitism during the period of the Holocaust. So I just found a few examples of that from Italian immigrant newspapers in New York who were printing example of bishops, for instance, in France in 1942, who spoke out against the deportation of Jews. So there are a few examples like that of Italian immigrants' news publication in New York, for instance, during the war. But that's the only few examples that I know.
Yeah, a couple of questions. Thank you for this interesting talk. One question about your, how you end talking about this shift from the rhetorical analogy to the interfaith dialogue. And I was wondering, I was struck by that quotation that you put on the screen about how the Christians were being also persecuted and so on, which is also a way of, again, not dealing, as a matter of fact, with persecuting Christians. So I was wondering if you could reflect on that. And the other question was just an information about, you know about Father Lafarge, who was involved in the writing of that famous encyclical, which was never, and he was also involved in this interracial dialogue. I mean, right, the attempt to deal with discrimination, racial discrimination, and so on. And I was wondering if the organizations that you mentioned were also dealing with these issues. You mentioned, right, the Jewish organization was certainly, but what about those Catholic organizations that you mentioned? Were they involved in any way also in the sort of struggle against racism?
Yeah, so the paradox is that Lafarge was a Jesuit priest, and he was a member also, an editor of America. So America was had this paradox of having both a main editor who was very conservative, pro-fascist and anti-Semitic, and then John Lafarge, who was very much more progressive in a way. And so, so John Lafarge was influential in the US at that time, and especially with interracial justice, his book and organization that very influenced Pope Pius XI, who asked him specifically because of that, because he knew that John Lafarge was involved in interracial justice. He asked him to draft the encyclical summer 1938, Humani Generis Unita, so claiming that there's only one type of humankind and there's no race. And it's also the first encyclical that would have been really showing that anti-Semitic persecutions were a denial of human rights. That's the first time, to my knowledge, that the word human rights appear in a Vatican document. But of course, the encyclical then was not published because Pius XI died and Pius XII did not choose to publish the encyclical. So that was just one of them. And here there's Joseph Kennedy, because the American Jewish Committee knew of the project, the secret project of encyclical through Joseph Kennedy. So John Lafarge told him, and Joseph Kennedy told the National Conference, Catholic Welfare Conference, and then the American Jewish Committee knew during the period. So there were connections related to that project. And definitely there are connections between the fight against racism generally and the fight against anti-Semitism. But that was also misleading for the American Jewish Committee because they really thought that the church condemnation of racism was necessarily something that meant that Christian anti-Semitism will disappear. But that was very misleading, I think.
Question, when the extent of what happened in the Holocaust, after the liberation of the camps began to be disseminated films and news reports in America, say in 1945 and 46, have there been any statements or comments by American bishops or leading members of the clergy after seeing the extent of it, more poignantly and more directly than may have been thought in the past?
I'm not sure about that because I haven't look too much at archives from that period after. I don't think so, actually. From what I saw in the American Jewish Community archives, they don't put forward statements from the hierarchy commenting on that. So I'm not sure. I know that there is statements about the deportation during the war, but I don't know after 45. But my impression is though is that this analogy between Christian and Jews became kind of impossible after the Holocaust because of the reality of what was the Holocaust, of course. So that's very disturbing to see in a way this kind of analogy between Christian being persecuted and Jews being persecuted, and I think that didn't work anymore after the Holocaust.
I have a question about, you mentioned that the AJC was reaching and intervening with the Vatican during the war. What does the AJC archive have in terms of the responses? Because obviously the Vatican had been closed until next year, but what are they getting, and what can we glean from the policies of the Vatican from the AJC archive?
There are different cases, but what I saw is that in the case of Hungary and Slovakia in '44, the American Jewish Committee is trying to reach the apostolic delegate in Washington to ask the Vatican to intervene. So there are a series of letters that I find in the American Jewish Committee archives about that. And basically they just got the answer that, yeah, the Vatican is doing its best to try to improve the situation of Jews in Hungary and Slovakia. So I know that there are some attempts through the apostolic delegate in Washington, but the story for now is very incomplete, so I need to go to the Vatican archives.
Yes.
I would like to get more clarification about what was going on with that magazine America. You seem to be indicating that there was an editor who was pro Coughlin, and then there was an editor who was not. And I also want to get a sense of that article that you projected a selection from spoke ominously about international Jewry. Was that an editorial, or was that an editorial?
No, there was an article, there was not an editorial.
Okay, so that was an article, so that could have been part of a kind of dialogue that was being presented in the magazine.
Yes, in a way, but that was still like, that is still so overtly anti-Semitic to publish that.
Well, of course.
Even though, it was not an editorial. But I think, America presented different points of view, clearly. But that was very like a mainstream magazine, so in a way it's still to show that it was not publishing something that was extreme necessarily, but that was very mainstream publication. But even though, despite this like plurality of diversity of editors within America, including John Lafarge in fact, but then the main editor, Francis Talbot, who was main editor of America between 36 and 44, was really like a friend of Charles Coughlin. That there are many letters. Charles Gallagher showed that there are many letters exchanged between them, and Francis Talbot, the main editor of America, wrote to the apostolic delegate in Washington to say that Coughlin in 1939 was correct and Christian. So to defend Coughlin, really. So there was very an intervention behind the scenes to prevent any sort of Vatican intervention to silence Coughlin.
Yes?
I just don't understand, what was the position, the official position of the church? Because I remember growing up and Catholic kids in my neighborhood would come and say to me, the nuns told us to stay away from you, you killed Christ. So, it's the same story we hear all the time, and so that's what I wanted to know.
So just, to clarify, this form of anti-Judaism based in religious teaching, what Jules Isaac called the teaching of contempt, that remained until 1965 and officially, and then in 1965 it was completely revised, but then that took a little bit of more time to be completely like enforced in local dioceses.
So wouldn't you say that that would have an impact on the situation, the anti-Semitism?
Oh yes, yeah, I think so, because, and when I look at Coughlin, for instance, it's always a mix, a combination of religious prejudices and social political prejudices. So I think there is no clear line between what we call Christian anti-Judaism and modern anti-Semitism. When we look at the propaganda, when we look at the text, it's actually very confusing because it's all mixed together. And because of that, I think that was more powerful.
As always, thank you, Nina. When you were talking earlier about how American Jews were trying to get Catholics to understand that first they come for us, then they come for you. So we have a commonality here. And of course, it brings to mind the great Martin Niemöller poem, first they came to the socialists, I did not speak out, I wasn't a socialist, etc., etc. I guess I'd like you to talk a little bit about, you didn't talk about this, but maybe you could talk a little bit out loud, especially in contemporary circumstances, about this effectiveness of trying to associate the persecution of the Jews with broader persecution, that there is a value in speaking out against this persecution, especially nowadays where you see a parallel rise in anti-Semitism in New York and America and Europe, along with the rise of anti-immigration, anti-migrant sentiment. I guess what I'm asking is, did the AJC truly believe that they could form this alliance based on a common fight against persecution? That did they truly believe that people would not? Did they truly believe in that strategy, or is it just the best option they had?
I think in some case, yes, and in some case that was more opportunistic, like a kind of opportunistic strategy. But I think in some case, yes, because then the bottom line of this kind of strategy was to defend religion and religious freedom in front of what they called totalitarian threats at that time, like totalitarianism. And they identified totalitarianism and sometimes statism as being the main threat against religion. So I think there was a position of defending the role of religion internationally and nationally. So I think some of these leaders were convinced, and some of them use it more as the best option, or more as something a little bit opportunistic, maybe. But for today, I think that's still something relevant in the sense that, especially that's why I showed the first cartoon about refugees, because I think in the recent attacks that we saw, especially in Pittsburgh, there's clearly the association between Jews in the US and refugees is still like something, it's still something very strong, and it's still something that motivated white supremacists in the US today.
If I could just very quickly follow up, in this particular case where they were fighting against the persecution of religion, I think the reason why it kind of sticks with me is that did they truly believe they could separate in the minds of American anti-Semites, Jew as race, Jew as religion?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think they were first of all trying to show that racism was anti-religious. That's what they were trying to argue, and they were trying to. Yeah, I think they were really trying to show that this was a threat against religion more broadly, and so that Jews and Catholics should fight together. But again, they didn't address the complexity of this issue, and that's why, for instance, they thought that the church condemning Nazi racism was equivalent to the church saying that it was not anti-Semitic anymore. And that's very something that was misleading.
So one last comment and we're
A quick follow-up about in the same boat in the Martin Niemöller. I'm aware that the most prominent Catholic politician in the Weimar Republic in Germany around 1920 made exactly that same point, that the extreme nationalist chauvinists who are going after the Jews right now. They're coming after the Catholics next. And I'm wondering if, so we saw it initiated from the Jewish perspective in America. I'm wondering if there was any other European, you know, whether Italy, France, or you're familiar where that same, in the same boat argument was made.
Yeah, even in the Vatican, in fact, I mean, Pius XI, Pius XI was very, very, I think, explicitly condemning exaggerated nationalism and racism in 1938, for instance. I mean, already in 37 with the encyclical against Nazis, but in 1938, it's pretty clear that he's going this way, like condemning exaggerated nationalism and racism as a form of also threat to religion, clearly. And he has the example in fascist Italy and then Nazi Germany. But then in some, I didn't mention that because I didn't have any time, but the American Jewish Committee was involved with German Catholic emigre in France, in Switzerland, and then in the US. So Joseph Wirth, that we've been talking about before. But so there is this continuity of this thought, German Catholic thought in the 20s, and then in the 1930s, through networks of German and Austrian immigrants. And of course, John Osterreicher is like the main example of that. And that also makes the continuity then with the period after the war and with Nostra Aetate and the revision of the Catholic teaching on Jews.
Right, more to do. Beginning back at the week of the 9th, the 10th, and many more events. Thank you.